Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Czech National Bank's meeting with analysts. Today we are here to present and discuss our new macroeconomic forecast and also the most recent decisions of the Bank Board. Our speakers for today are Jan Freit, Deputy Governor of the Czech National Bank.
Good morning.
Petr Král, Executive Director of the Monetary Department.
Hello to everyone.
And Karel Musil, Director of the Macroeconomic Forecasting Division of the Czech National Bank. And now we are ready to start with presentation of the new macroeconomic forecast, which was prepared by economists from the Monetary Department. Karel, the floor is yours.
So thank you, and once again, good morning to everybody. It's my pleasure to present here the new macroeconomic projection. And before I do that, I will start with the brief discussion of the assumption of the new macroeconomic projection. Then I will jump to the forecast itself. I will quickly also describe the difference between the new projection and the previous one from the spring projection round. And at the end, I will also discuss two additional scenarios that we prepared on top of the baseline scenario. It's the summer projection, so I would say traditionally extended the forecast horizon to cover also, in this case, year 2025. So let me start with the assumptions of the new macroeconomic projection, and I will start with the external environment. In this case, it's obvious from the data that the effective euro area went through a technical recession at the beginning of this year. Having a flash estimate of GDP, it's also obvious that the economic growth will be just subdued, and that's valid also for the rest of the year. That simply reflects the global environment itself and also the impact of the fiscal and monetary policy in the euro area. It means that the recovery will appear during 2024, and we assume that the economic growth of the euro area will be about 1.3%. What is more interesting is the development of the prices in the Eurozone. In our case, we are interested mainly in the producer prices. And we can clearly see that after the peak in May, the producer prices started to, or the inflation of the producer prices started to decline. And indeed, recently we can observe even a decline in the prices itself. So what is clear from this picture is the fact that it's driven mainly by the energy prices that are decreasing. And after the relatively high dynamics during the previous year, when the PPI dynamics was about 35% for the current year, 2023, we expect that the prices for the whole year remains roughly stable. This situation is reflected by the actions of the European Central Bank, and indeed the bank increased interest rates 2 times in June, July recently by 0.25 percentage points. It's not, or we cannot rule out that there will be another increase during the September meeting. So it means that indeed the 3 months Euribor will indeed finish this year at about 4%. At the same time, the central bank also reduces its balance sheet, which is reflected by the trajectory of the shadow rates. So overall, the global or the foreign environment is deflationary, and that will impact the domestic economy, and I will highlight that once again later. The second assumption is about the fiscal policy. It's the domestic fiscal policy, and indeed after the roughly neutral impact of the fiscal policy during this year, we believe that there will be a negative contribution to the growth during the next year, which is related mainly to the consolidation package that is prepared by the government, and the impact will go mainly through the private consumption of the households. When we discuss the fiscal policy, it's not just about the impact on the economic growth, but also the impact of these measures to the price dynamics. And here we have to distinguish between the impact that is captured through the first round compared to the second round impacts of the changes in the indirect taxes. So when we speak about 2024, especially about the beginning of this year, indeed the first round impact, so which is the accounting impact, so indeed the impact when there is a change in the taxation that will be fully passed to the changes in the prices. So we can see that the impact of the consolidation package together with the increase of the excise duty on tobacco and alcohol will be just slightly positive, which is fine. What is more visible here is the second round impact, so indeed the impact on top of the this accounting change in the prices, so the difference between the first round impact and the final price. And here it's positive, so it means indeed we assume that the reduction in VAT that is linked to the consolidation package will not result in a decline of the prices, but the prices remain somehow elevated, and that will be the impact that we capture through the second round effects. Here it just simply means that the producers in the domestic economy use this opportunity and keep the prices slightly higher than it should be the case in case of the accounting impact, and it will temporarily increase the profit margins at the beginning of the next year. So having these main assumptions, let me introduce the forecast itself. I will start with the inflation, and from the data it's clear that during the second quarter headline inflation decreased. Indeed, this tendency will continue also in the forthcoming months. However, this will be temporarily stopped during the fourth quarter of this year, when the base effect will play a significant role, and this base effect is related to the changes of energy prices. Indeed, the introduction of the energy-saving tariffs by the government during the last quarter of the previous year, and then in year-on-year dynamics, it appears at the end of this year. Once this base effect disappears, then the inflation quickly drop close to the inflation target and stays there, indeed, over the whole forecast horizon, including the monetary policy horizon, which is the second half of the next year. When I was speaking about this base effects, I will indeed illustrate that further by the first picture here. So we just simply calculated what would have been the headline inflation when we adjust it by the effect of this energy-saving tariffs. So it means that simply at the end of the previous year, the headline inflation would have been higher, and then because there will be no base effect, then the inflation would gradually and smoothly decline back to the or close to the inflation target and stays there. The base effect, indeed, it's linked to the energy prices. So the lower picture shows that in the fourth, that shows administrative prices, and it's clear that in the fourth quarter of the previous year, there is negative contribution of the electricity prices, and then relatively big contribution of the same component in the last quarter of this year, indeed capturing the base effect, and it will disrupt the tendency of the regulated prices to gradually slow down. Once this base effect disappears, then the headline inflation really drop to the close of the inflation target. It's the contribution of all the components that is causing this pattern. Of course, the main contribution goes from the core inflation, and in this case we clearly see that the dynamics of core prices are gradually declining. The peak is already in the previous year, and it's driven not only by the imputed trends where the contribution indeed disappear. To be precise, there is small negative contribution, but also by the other components of the core inflation that reflects the disinflationary process that is happening in the domestic economy. What is also useful to highlight here in case of core inflation is the fact that despite its deceleration during next year, during 2024, core inflation remains relatively high, above the 2%, and it will converge to this value during 2025. If I am highlighting that there is a disinflationary process that is indeed linked to the dynamics of the core prices, it's illustrated in this case for the dynamics of the marginal costs in the production sector in the domestic economy. And the peak of the growth of the costs is the end of 2022. Then the costs are decelerating in its dynamics, and the deceleration is driven by the negative contribution of the energy prices. So indeed, that's the impact of the decline in global or foreign energy prices, and through the imported prices, it's impacting the domestic economy. But and at the same time, also the contribution of the domestic intermediate good prices is gradually declining over the whole forecast horizon. The reason behind this decline in the domestic economy, that's the decomposition, that is the lower left picture. We can see that indeed the high wage dynamics is gradually slowing down, and it's supported by the positive contribution, or in this case negative contributions, of the improving productivity or labor efficiency. At the same time, the whole environment can be also described by the fact that still we have relatively high positive gaps of the profit markups. So the companies are using this opportunity to reprice and earn some extra profits. Nevertheless, the markups will gradually decline and returning back to zero as the recovery in the economy, in the domestic economy, is just gradual. There will be an impact of the restrictive fiscal and monetary policy. The only exception with this decline tendency is the first quarter of the next year, which is the impact of the second round effect. So there will be decrease in VAT. Nevertheless, the prices will not drop by the same magnitude, so there is positive second round effect that will be reflected in the markups of the companies. This is valid for the whole economy, so it's not related just to the final producer sector, but also the intermediate sector, so for the domestic producers. For the domestic economy, as I have already highlighted, the dynamics of the inflationary pressures or the costs for the production is driven by the dynamics of the nominal wage. So indeed, the overall situation on the labor market. In terms of year-on-year changes for nominal wages, there will be further increase for the business sector. Indeed, just using the opportunity of having or generating extra profit and the overall situation on the market, which is overheated, and then the wages will, in year-on-year dynamics, they will just gradually decline. What is clear from here, indeed, even at the end of 2025, the dynamics will not converge back to the long-run equilibrium, which is 5%, but still remains elevated above this level. So that's indeed the result of the overall situation on the labor market that might be described through the labor utility composite index. And from its dynamics, it's clear that indeed the cooling down of the labor market is over, and the situation on the labor market will be a bit more tougher throughout the rest of the year and over 2024 and 25. That's related mainly to the real part of the labor market, so it means to the development of the employment, so it means that will generally continue to grow during the rest of this year and indeed stabilize during 2024-25. We can also see that the unemployment rate will just gradually increase. There is no big change. Generally, also the demand for the labor on the labor market is still relatively high. This picture must be accompanied by the fact that despite the relatively high wage growth, there was big drop in real wages. We can discuss indeed the volume of the whole wages and salaries. And the situation will change towards the end of the year, and especially during 2024-25, when the real wages will grow and indeed catch up the loss that was caused by the high inflation in the previous periods. The dynamics of the real wages and salaries is the important factor that is driving the domestic consumption of the household. So indeed, we can see that really the drop in real income is linked to the negative contribution of the households for the economic growth during this year, as the real wages growth will be renewed during the next year. Also, the contribution of the households' consumption turn into the positive numbers. From the decomposition, it's also clear that indeed the economic growth is driven by the positive contribution of the net exports, especially during this and the next year. And overall, it means that the domestic economy will stagnate during this year and growth by, let's say, roughly 2.5 during 2024 and 2025. By checking the flash release of the Czech Statistical Office that was on Monday, indeed that release was very close to the number that we have for the second quarter for the GDP growth, so it's in line with the projection. Jumping deeper into the components of GDP, we can clearly see the story that is behind the household consumption. So indeed, really improving the situation about the real income will increase the household consumption in year-on-year terms. It means that the consumption will grow during 2024. When we check quarter-on-quarter change, it's already the second half of this year that there will be recovery in the consumption. Indeed, the growth of the consumption will be negatively impacted by the fiscal consolidation that is planned for 2020-24, and it's also impacting the trajectory of the real consumption of the government that remains subdued for the whole forecast horizon. Indeed, similar picture as it is for the consumption is for the private investment, that we can see just gradual increase in the investment activity. What is more important for the gross capital formation as the whole is the contribution of the changes in inventories, and here we just simply believe that the unfinished production that was accumulated during the past periods will be finished, and that will help to reduce the inventories, and it means that the contribution is negative. This finished production, part of that will be exported together with gradually gradually recovering foreign demand. It means that the dynamics of the exports remains relatively high during 2023, 2024, indeed higher than the growth of the imports that just reflects the domestic absorption. And together it means that really the contribution of the net export that will be positive will help to increase the domestic growth. For the projection of the exchange rate, then we expect that the value for the third quarter, the average value for the third quarter will be around 23.8 crown per euro. After that, the exchange rate will gradually depreciate to the levels above 24.5 crown per euro. The reason behind this depreciation is indeed narrowing interest rate differentials, so the difference between domestic and foreign rates. Against this pressure, there is appreciation tendency of the exchange rate that is impacted by the improving trade balance. And on top of that, we also used expert judgments that we reduced the impact of the interest rate differential in the exchange rate through the exchange rate equation. And then consistently with this projection, there is a decline in market interest rates that is indeed over the whole projection horizon. And the decline is linked really to the situation that the extraordinary inflationary pressures that the domestic economy experienced are gradually fading out. It's linked to the foreign economy, global environment, where the energy prices and also the core prices are declining, and at the same time also to the domestic economy. Indeed, the situation about the wage dynamics that is gradually reducing its pace, also closing of the markups in the production sectors. Indeed, together it simply means that inflation will decline to the inflation target, stays at the inflation target, and it generates or creates a scope to reduce gradually the domestic interest rates to adapt the tightness of the monetary policy to the situation in the economy. So having a picture about the new projection, I will quickly compare this to the previous one from the spring forecasting round. Indeed, in case of headline inflation, the new projection is slightly, on average, slightly lower than the previous one. It's mainly driven by core inflation. And here, in case of core inflation, the main driver is the decline in the foreign prices that is stronger than we assumed for the previous projection. One of the factors that is also contributing to the lower core inflation is lower dynamics of the wage behavior in the market sector. That's slightly lower compared to the previous projection, reflecting mainly the recent observation and the historical revision that we experienced. In case of economic activity, it's lower compared to the previous projection, reflecting mainly lower consumption and investment activity. Here, the driver is mainly the fiscal consolidation that is planned for the next year. In case of exchange rate, the trajectory or the outlook is slightly weaker, reflecting the narrowing of the inflation differential that is faster or quicker compared to the previous projection. And at the same time, also, the recent observations of the exchange rate that are weaker are shifting the whole trajectory to be weaker. In case of the difference for the trajectories for interest rates, The new one is slightly higher than in the previous projection round, and when we check the factors that are contributing to that, it's mainly the foreign environment, the contribution of the red bars. In this case, it's mainly the revision of the foreign interest rates that are higher compared to the outlook that we used in the spring forecasting round. In the opposite direction, it's the contribution, negative contribution of the initial states, which captures indeed newly data, and they were lower household consumption. At the same time, also lower wage growth, and as I a couple of times already highlighted, the outlook of the foreign prices that is lower compared to the previous projection. During 2024, there is negative contribution of the fiscal impulse, so the introduction of the consolidation package of the government to the projection. It was not included in the spring projection. And as the last point here, I will comment the expert judgments that are contributing at the end of this year and at the beginning of the next year positively to the difference in these two trajectories. And that's exactly the impact of these second round effects to the markups of the producers that we judgmentally adjusted in the projection. So it means higher prices will lead to the higher trajectory of the interest rates at the end of this year. And there is because this change is at the beginning of 2024, so the contribution 1 quarter before is just the forward-looking response or reaction to this. At the end of 2024, the expert judgments are indeed turning into negative contribution, and that's the result of the fact that these second round effects are gradually disappearing, and as we used the judgments for exchange rate, so to reduce the impact of the interest rate differential on the exchange rate, these judgments overweights there. At the last part of the presentation, I will discuss 2 additional scenarios that we have prepared. The first one is indeed reflecting the situation in the baseline scenario. So the baseline scenario just simply shows that there is a decline in the nominal interest rates. That is indeed reflecting the fact that inflation just simply dropped to the inflation target and stays there. Of course, there is a chance that indeed the monetary policy might be tighter for a longer period just to ensure that bringing inflation back to the target will be robust and indeed permanent, and there is no risk of deviation of the inflation from the target. So for this, we just replicate the simulation from the previous forecasting round. So we use this common inflation expectations index, which is a combination of expectation of the agents in the economy 1 year ahead, and it's a combination of the expectation from the financial market, companies, and the households. So together, this index just simply says that the inflation expectations are gradually, or indeed quickly declining. Nevertheless, still the new data shows that the level of the expectations is still elevated. So we used this index to the extended version of the core projection model. The extension is indeed the endogenous part that is describing possible de-anchoring of the inflation expectations and run the simulation. On top of that, we assume here that the nominal interest rates will stay at the current level till the end of this year. But despite this fact, it still means that the inflation will remain slightly higher compared to the baseline scenario. It's, the higher inflation is indeed supported also by slightly more depreciated exchange rate, as the higher inflation expectations are pushing for the nominal exchange rate depreciation that adds through the imported prices to the headline inflation. The second scenario is just motivated by the recent observation about the behavior of the savings of the households. And indeed, the recent data shows that still the saving rate is relatively high in the first quarter, about 18%. And baseline scenario just simply assume that the saving rates will gradually declining. So there is a possible scenario that this pace of the decline will be a bit faster. So in the scenario, we just assume that the saving rates will quickly drop to 12%, which is the historical average, and the drop will be within the second half of this year. This just simply means that there will be additional incentive for the consumption, and it means that it will generate some extraordinary inflationary pressures in the domestic economy. So it means that the monetary policy tries to react to these extraordinary inflationary pressures that are coming from the consumption or from the economic activity, and the response of the monetary policy just simply shows that the trajectory of the interest rates should be higher compared to the baseline scenario. This higher trajectory is pushing for the more appreciated exchange rate, so we need both of the components of the monetary conditions, interest rates and exchange rates are tighter compared to the baseline scenario, which simply ensures that the inflation stays close to the inflation target or close to the trajectory of the baseline scenario. So that's all from my side, and thanks for your attention.
This was the macroeconomic forecast, which was prepared by economists from the monetary department, and even more information will be available next Friday on our website in the monetary policy report. Yes, it will be published on our website next Friday, 11th August at 9 a.m. So now we can move to questions and answers. Please, before you ask the question, activate your microphone and please introduce yourself. So is there anyone who wants to ask the first question? Okay.
Good morning, Jan Bureš, CSOB and Patria Finance. My question concerns first the Czech koruna, as you abandoned the regime in which you somehow kept potential losses of the Czech koruna. My question rather goes to the assumptions of the model. Were there any changes in the sensitivities of inflation to the exchange rate during the pandemics and the energy crisis, or do you view it within your model framework more or less the same as before the crisis? If you could briefly comment on that. And then second question maybe to Mr. Freit. Yesterday, if I'm correct, Aleš Michal mentioned that the majority of the board assesses the risks towards the most recent forecast as being rather pro-inflationary. But probably not all the whole board assesses the risks the same. So my question is, how large is the majority in terms of that assessment, and maybe what's your personal view on the risks concerning this forecast?
As for the first question, I can say that we haven't introduced any changes to the exchange rate pass-through elasticity or sensitivities in the model reflecting the previous intervening regime on the foreign exchange rate market, or any changes to this model sensitivity reflecting the energy crisis or the COVID crisis. The parameters of the model in this case are still the same.
Sure. The individual board members assign different weight to each alternative scenario or baseline scenario and then the alternative scenarios. But I think that all board members do take the risks implied by the alternative scenarios very seriously. In particular, the probability that the inflationary expectations are not perfectly anchored. So I think there is a general agreement on the existence of such risk, and we understand that the notion of the last difficult mile is well founded. So I think generally we have pretty strong agreement throughout the board.
Any other questions?
Martin Paul, General Investments. I will start with a technical question. It relates to the shadow Euribor assumption. To get some flavor about the sensitivity, how this assumption relates to the actual pace of quantitative tightening by ECB. I think it's roughly 30 billion euro currently. What is the sensitivity or in terms of basis points of the gap? And the second question relates to the FX policy or to the policy of reinvestments of proceeds from FX reserves. Why the board still believes it's better, let's say, to be, let's say it frankly, not transparent about the volumes and so on, because the practice it's not that one way among other central banks. Many central banks are much more transparent, at least, releasing the volumes and so on. Why the Czech National Bank prefers be not transparent, even in case of interest rates? The Czech National Bank was among the first banks releasing the interest rate trajectory and so on.
Our forecasts explicitly take into account the announced pace of the reduction of the ECB's balance sheet, and we use our standard rule of thumb computation, and you can see in the slide number 3 that the shadow rate is moving above the headline 3-month Euribor rate, reflecting the fact that the ECB is on its way to reduce its balance sheet. The precise description of the computation of this rule of thumb coefficient was published in a box or in a short explanatory note on our website 2 years ago approximately, and we haven't changed this computation at all. We just adjust the assumptions of the new forecast to the current market outlook for the headline Euribor, based on the recent ECB's action in terms of further hikes that are delivered or are expected to be delivered in the coming future. And the program of reduction, the balance sheet, has also been taken into account at a face value using the same coefficient from the rule of thumb computation as before.
As far as I understand, the second question was about the volume of sales of the proceeds from FX reserves. as previously, the sales of the income from FX reserves should be carried in a way that is not influencing the exchange rate levels. And therefore, we cannot estimate the volume of sales in different periods. Sometimes the conditions in the FX market could be such that it is relatively easy to sell proceeds without impacting the exchange rate. Sometimes it may not be that easy. So basically, there is no reason for excessive transparency in that sense. You can somehow calculate the proceeds from FX reserves we are likely to have, and we communicate that some part of these proceeds should be sold, and so you can roughly estimate the volume of sales throughout the year. So I think it's not that difficult, but we don't think revealing numbers would have any value added to understanding of the monetary policy process. So this is why we decided to be relatively qualitative, not entirely quantitative.
Thank you. Yes.
Jaromír Šindel, Citibank. I have two questions on forecast and two questions for Governor Fried. The first regarding the forecast is, why do you forecast no growth in employment after the second quarter of 2024, despite the GDP growth seems to be relatively solid? The second question is that if you can provide some information, what is your estimate of impact of the fiscal consolidation on the household disposable income, if you can share it with us? And the questions for Vice Governor Fried is, back to this question, does it mean that, because in the past, Czech National Bank published these volumes with the 2 months delay, it will continue in the way? Okay. And the second question is that if I look at the forecast, it forecasts relatively strong core CPI growth in 2024-25. If I look at the alternative scenario, they probably forecast even larger core CPI growth in these years. So from my perspective, it's relatively, and you mentioned that the majority of the bank board respect this risk to the forecast. So it's, to be honest, it's a bit surprising to me that you have, eliminated the sentence from the statement about the possible hike at the next meeting. If I look all these things, let's say it's relatively surprising to me. Thank you. So if you can elaborate a bit, why do you eliminate this sentence? Thank you very much.
For the first question, the employment is expected to stop growing after a few quarters because of the fact that the Czech labor market is fully exhausted and there is no more labor force available to be hired, basically. And for the effect of fiscal consolidation package on domestic, on household consumption and disposable income, this channel is the dominant one when computing the effect of fiscal consolidation package on GDP growth. The overall fiscal impulse stemming from next year consolidation package is minus 0.9% to GDP dynamics. So the consolidation effort of the government will curb GDP growth by almost 1 percentage point. And 0.6 percentage points from that will be going through private consumption by curbing private consumption growth via cutting the via all those measures on both revenue and expenditure side of public budgets that have been taken into the consideration. Next week, when we publish our monetary policy report, you will find a specific part of the text dedicated to that computation.
I think there is a general agreement between staff and the board that the potential for relatively high core inflation relative to CPI or monetary policy inflation is a case for being cautious in terms of cutting rates, and that even the trajectory we have in the forecast or the baseline of alternatives would secure price stability over the medium term. I think the fact that the forecast of the core inflation being at 3.5 or so is a strong argument for, okay, be careful, don't expect that we would rush in terms of cutting significantly. And at the same time, the fact that we removed the sentence that next time we would keep rates unchanged or hike does not mean that we eliminated any possibility of hiking. We just moved to more symmetric approach, saying that it is very likely that next move is down, but at the same time we can imagine the situations likely associated with external developments that would make us or force us to hike. So that we just move to more symmetric approach.
Thanks for the answers. Are there any other questions?
Good morning, Radomír Jáč, Generali Investments. I have one technical question which I would address to Monetary Department. It's related to the common inflation expectations indicator, as Mr. Musil commented on. A really very simple question: where do you take from the inflation expectations of households? Because I know that it's very usually very sensitive data with a lot of suspects about its reliability. So whether you take it from the Czech Statistical Office surveys of like expectations, or whether you have some own survey or methodology. Thank you.
These are data published by the European Commission. It is a survey harmonized among European Union countries, and the officially published data are expressed in a qualitative way, but using our bilateral contract with one Czech domestic institution, we can get to individual figures in quantitative dimensions, and based on that, we compute this sub-index within the composite inflation expectations index.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure whether there is some source that I am not aware of, or whether you make it in your own way as you described. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, I can see any raised hands. Okay, another one.
Yes, I'm sorry. If I can have a question for staff and also for Vice Governor. The question for the staff is about, if you look at the PMI indicators, industrial sentiment, they envisage a risk of the industrial recession. And if I look at your forecast of the export growth, my forecast of export growth, compared with the foreign demand outlook, I see their ongoing outperformance of the Czech export activity compared to foreign demand growth, if I look from the very long-term perspective. So my question is whether, how seriously do you take this message coming from these PMI indicators, and how does it influence your forecast, if there was any influence? And the question for Vice Governor Wright is about what we see in the baseline scenario is a divergence between the core and non-core CPI. And if the core CPI surprise on the downside, that we have, let's say, weaker core CPI growth, more or less within the inflation target, in 2024, it would imply possibly inflation to be below the target in 2024. If energy prices, food prices surprise on the upside, we can get even lower. So what would be the response of the Czech National Bank Board to this development if they were overlook this non-core driven undershooting of the inflation target, or possible undershooting of the inflation target in 2024, and what would be the response? Thank you.
I see your point that Czech export performance have tended to outperform somewhat the pace that would be implied by the current foreign demand growth, and it is particularly because of the fact that Czech exporting firms, automotive sector, manufacturing sector, is now capable to complete the previously unfinished production, because the functioning of global value and production chains has normalized, and the current export performance is reflecting not only the current demand, but also the backlog of the previously uncovered orders from the external side. And this is particularly, from a part explaining very significant contribution of net export to GDP growth for this year. But we are aware of the signs that Germany is, let's say, moving close to a recession. Part of that might be of a cyclical pattern, part of that might be of a structural pattern, and all these, let's say, information, including PMI indices, are seriously taken into account when preparing and adjusting the forecast within the preparatory stages. We will get some further data during next couple of weeks and months, and we will adjust our new forecast if necessary, reflecting these figures. Currently, we are let's say, we can say that the balance of risks of the GDP forecast and foreign demand outlook is relatively balanced.
Okay, as to the second question, I think I can be pretty open. I think that there is a pretty strong consensus in the board that we have something which can be labeled bad deflation or bad disinflation, or good deflation, good disinflation. And in the case we have very positive terms of trade shock or very strong decline, for example, in energy prices, we would not view it as something that is risk to price stability. And I also think that the public or any politicians, anyone would view it as something which is not consistent with our objectives. So I would personally view it as more as some kind of error correction. So we definitely would not rush in panic to cut rates to extremely low levels. So that's I think would happen actually. And as a matter of fact, the forecast assumes pretty low inflation in 2025. So I think it's also this view is somehow embodied in the existing baseline scenario.
Thanks for the answers. Any other questions?
Good morning, Roman Renda, Czech Chamber of Commerce. To me, it's still a bit unclear what will cause the increase in unemployment. So if you could try to explain a bit more in depth what will cause the unemployment to grow despite the growth in GDP. Thank you.
Actually, the increase in unemployment rate is very marginal, and the Czech Republic will stay the country with the lowest unemployment rate, or one of the lowest unemployment rates in the European Union. The increase is let's say, a technical result of some changes to labor force and to the fact that there might be some changes to hours worked and the length of the and to changes to the hours worked, but basically, as the Lucy indicator has shown, this increase cannot be interpreted as a losing tightness in the labor market. Rather, the other way around is true. And as the economy will be gradually recovering from the current situation, the labor market will increase its tightness further, but this tightness will not reach the pre-COVID levels.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Maybe one last question. It came up to my mind that the governor recently commented that he's concerned with the loss of central bank, something what was not such a big concern in the past years. I just wanted to know the opinion of Jan Freit, whether this is a shared concern of the board, or whether there are other board members who share that concern, or whether this is rather the opinion of the governor.
Okay, so I think we as a board, we have not had a I would say, deep or extensive discussion on this issue that would be associated with monetary policy. So I would then, in this case, recommend to ask Governor next time. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have one question that relates to the, let's say, your preference of scenarios presented today, whether you prefer the baseline or the alternative scenario, because yesterday I had the impression from governor's words that the majority of the board prefers the alternative scenario.
Okay, I just repeat that individual board members definitely assign different weights to each scenario. We don't question the baseline actually, but generally, but at the same time, all board members do take very seriously the alternative scenarios and do apply these scenarios in shaping their decisions. I think we generally, board members assign higher weight to the scenario with potential for wage inflation spiraling than to the consumption increase scenario. But as I say, individually it could differ. So, but there was not disagreement about this scenario, that scenario, or the other scenario. So as I say, there were all scenarios were viewed as relevant and important.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, since there are not any, I would like to give Mr. Deputy Governor a floor for his final statement.
Okay, I have one warning actually. For a long time, for a year, you could see the sentence on the readiness of the board to respond to major shocks to the exchange rate. We changed the sentence in the press release or in the statement, saying that we are ready anytime as a part of managed float to respond to major shocks to currency rate, and at the same time we have resumed selling proceeds from FX reserves. This is a new standard long-term approach, and if you don't see that sentence next time in the press release or in the statement, please do not think that this is a change of the long-term approach. We just move back to normal situation. So this is what I would like to stress. So maybe to avoid a confusion. And second, I would like to thank you for the discussions we have throughout the previous year, and for your sometimes challenging contributions to this discussion. I think we've come through a year which was one of the more interesting in our professional lives, and I'm afraid that the next year will be less interesting, but still I hope that we will see you here and we will have an opportunity to discuss the economic developments with you. So again, thank you and have a nice rest of the summer.